Olá pessoal, muito bem-vindos novamente ao GTR 49 e lembrando, o GTR 49 inserido na 10ª semana de infraestrutura da internet no Brasil. Hoje é o primeiro dia, o evento vai até sexta-feira. Amanhã nós teremos o GTS e quarta, quinta e sexta o IX Fórum. Então, para dar continuidade agora ao evento, nós vamos ter o Bruno Bioni, da Data Privacy Brasil, falando um pouquinho para a gente sobre LGPD. O que muda no gerenciamento de incidentes de segurança? Bruno, por favor.
Bom, primeiramente, bom dia a todos e todas. Eu queria agradecer muito o convite na pessoa do Fred, do Rubens, Klaus, Cris, enfim, são amigos, né? Eu tive a oportunidade de trabalhar no NIC.br, então é sempre bom estar de volta nesse espaço que é super privilegiado para a gente poder fazer discussões e especificamente sobre o tema da qual eu tenho trabalhado aí durante os últimos anos, que é sobre proteção de dados pessoais. Então, o que a gente pensou hoje, conversando inclusive com os organizadores e as organizadoras do evento.
Today, talking with the event organizers, we have a talk where we can address a scenario about data privacy, and similarly, we could have a bridge about those communities from personal data and also security, network security, and so on and so forth. So my main goal is to understand how this LGPD can really be part of this structure and scope of a security incident. And with that in mind, we can understand that structure from two different pillars. Our talk will be addressed from two different perspectives. To see that as a window of opportunity, personal data protection, LGPD, can be a friend and not an enemy for those that were working with security incident and network security. And on a second perspective, how can LGPD be able to rise new frontiers for security incident management, and what can be changed in that new perspective? Is there a duty for that in security incidents, and how should that happen? How can LGPD will establish obligations, and how can we take a communication plan on a policy of security incidents? And that will be addressed in details on during the second part of my presentation. So let's start addressing LGPD from a window of opportunity perspective. How can that help security incident teams to be able to gather a higher budget for different areas, and also to be able to go through that network narrative together to that speech of LGPD attempts? And I'd like to start this conversation going through a icon which is fully embedded in our discussion and which is part of our governance programs and different projects that are based on this pillar. LGPD is an additional obstacle for business, for the creation of a new business model, new public policies for innovation. But that's not quite the case. It's the opposite. LGPD, and that is not just a privilege in Brazil, that is taking place all over. When we see what the goal is and the main concern for an LGPD law is exactly to reconcile and compromise the rights of the owners of citizens. I mean, we citizens that are the ones that use public services, financial services, and a number of different platforms where our data goes through. and at the same time to guarantee that economic agents, they can clearly see what they can and cannot do, to be able to have a horizon where they can support their rights. Therefore, LGPD is based on two roles, not just to help and support what can be done to protect citizens' data, but also to allow an instruction manual, sort of speaking, about how economic agents, public and private entities may deal and manage private information, private data. And any information agency will demand that we organize our information as if that would be a data wardrobe. It is impossible to know which sort of data we have within our organization if we do not map all processes that we have in-house. Therefore, an LGPD law and a journey where we adapt this act will create that window of opportunity where all this will be able to arrange that in a certain order. And once we organize that, we are able to better see what our assets are and we'll be able to extract value from that asset. In a network security scenario, we know that is not able to have a safe infrastructure if we are not aware about that infrastructure. It's impossible to create security standards if we do not know what our database is, who is accessing that and how they are accessing that database. And once LGPD has been approved, there is a community that is trying to do their best, which is exactly network security team, which is a pillar to allow LGPD to be supported. There is, you guarantee integrity, availability, visibility of a database as part of a safe environment. And LGPD, that's why I say that LGPD is a friend and not an enemy, as I see that as a window of opportunity for those teams that for quite a while they have been doing their best to create and raise their budgets and to expand that budget, and that is been possible now during that journey of adaptation. And this is a worthwhile investment. We right now are within a scenario where organizations, they are not just concluding their adaptation projects, but they are quite closer to that. We have seen some reports where organizations, they are recovering investments, and not only they are taking the fruits of those investments, they are harvesting the fruits of that investments. And there is an important pillar, which is information security, and that is worthwhile. There is a payoff, and 40% of those organizations, they perceive benefits that you may reach as part of gathering and structuring all processes together. With that in mind, I'd like to start this discussion considering that LGPD and this journey is perceived as a window of opportunity where we have an act that should not be enforced in Brazil that would help our country, but not only this is an act that could be a way to attract the organization of processes for different entities. And this is an opportunity not only to revise and maintain existing products, but also to reach new business models for public, for new business. And this security perspective should be considered since the very beginning of any journey. Some products, they are released and security is included just in the last phase of the process. And this is the worst case scenario. Therefore, those adaptation scenarios, they are now included, and we wanted to have a synchronized teams where this act is not just valid to diagnose risks, but also to allow an added value that can be generated, an innovation based on data, and that data will be dealt on a environment that is highly secure. And if you understand that this reputation will not be calibrated with some sanctions if there is a data breach, but also you can work on a calibration that is based on transparency, balance, in case you have any security incidents. And to be able to align this talk, it seems that it's a great advantage for any department that will work around this project, especially those departments that work with network security, information security, to see LGPD not as an obstacle, not as a bump that you may have within your journey or ahead your journey, but what would get you to your final stop that will allow you to have more innovation, competitiveness, and is a positive aspect. Okay, from a practical standpoint, I understand the idea. I know where I can get included if I will be part of a meeting where there is a legal department, a compliance department, but now I should understand from a material and concrete standpoint, how can that help me if I gather with my team and if I'm dealing with the personal or not data to defense data and the network as a whole. LGPD, and that's exactly why that works with a double role, which works not only with individuals, but also organizations that deal with that data in a very responsible way. And it is said that if you are able to meet and fulfill all the rules of the game, you have the right to deal with that data. I mean, not just the owner of that information, but the responsible use of that information. And if you have that possibility of use, that will be part of this legal base, which compromises 10 pillars that will support personal data management. What is new here? What is the new scenario? You don't have to go back to get an authorization of citizens to manage personal data. You can get just one informed consent for those 10 bases. The Brazilian law, it might be the most flexible act in comparison to other foreigner laws for comparison rights, because our act is more robust. With that, we have a higher flexibility for organizations to deal with personal data, which impacts positively on a specific group of this organization, which is exactly a department of those who are in charge to look after information security and data security as part of an organization. We know that usually to be able to ensure a safe environment, you have to monitor your work environment. You have to know and monitor who access it, when, where from, if that access is external, internal, to monitor if there is a physical segmentation of that and not just a logical segmentation of who will access that server and from where from. Therefore, work monitoring, that is one of the bottlenecks of security information from a human perspective, where it involves, and it will always involve, personal data management. And it states what your operator or collaborator may or may not access. And if we perceive any sort of vulnerability, the collection of data and access of data to that database will generate a register, a history of that access. And that may be part of a personal data definition. And the question to be asked is, Will that require a consent to manage personal data? No. According to LGPD, addresses 10 legal bases which goes beyond consent. And one of the effective novelties that have raised with LGPD is the legal interest. There is a legitimate for interest from public and privacy entities that will guarantee security to an infrastructure where you guarantee information integrity and the accidental or external use by third parts. As an organization, you may create and manage data from this specific legal base. There is that interest, there is that legitimacy to create and manipulate data. So this is a preventive perspective where that monitoring will anticipate security incidents. But we know that sometimes the question is not if I will face a security incident, but when we see organizations that have high level of maturity and they still suffer some attacks and they are exposed. And after that has happened, what to do? We have to deal with that. We have to investigate from an internal approach. We have to know from where from that vulnerability has come, who has affected that, and how. And once again, I will be facing a scenario as an organization to manage personal data. And once again, LGPD, it will work in our favor, as it will allow us to investigate internally and not necessarily asking for an authorization or for a consent from those who are under suspicion of being part of that process of vulnerability, of that security incident that we have faced, because there is that legal base to support and to cope with that situation. And last but not least, we know that those organizations that have a higher level of maturity, and we have some hubs for security incidents, and those hubs, they create a network where they exchange information about attacks. They exchange information such as where that attack is coming from, such as an IP address, and that IP address may be considered personal data, among some other information that could be included as part of that concept of personal data. Therefore, once again, LGPD will add legal support to allow those departments to keep doing what they used to do, exchanging information to create that intelligence network and be able to coordinate all answers. Once again, there is no need to go after consent, as that would be just impossible and not desirable to be reached. And again, we have that base of legal interest. We have a legitimacy of that legal interest. And just for you to understand that from a major scope and to understand how friendly LGPD can be from our community, such a community that we are here being representing, GDPR, which is the European regulation for personal data, it has in its consideration why they have that formulation where some exercises they can deal with that from a legal perspective. By doing that, it would be able to escalate operations. Therefore, the European law and the Brazilian law has inspired itself into the European Act, saying by some security incidents may be supported over it to create security to what you have been doing for quite a while. So as part of all these perspectives, I believe it's quite clear that LGBT works on a window of opportunity to gather resources, to create some departments, and to allow legal guarantee that by personal data, allowing a environment which is safe and secure, you can link that to an environment that will help you to make that operation free and legal.
Well, the second point I'd like to discuss is about being a pillar regarding personal data generation. There is a chapter in which best practices are addressed. So as an organization, it's up to you to actually create this security infrastructure. And it's probably the first time in Brazil in which we have this type of dialogue regarding information security. And I'm talking about legislation. I'm not talking about other standards or decrees by the executive. And besides that, we are also going to add a new chapter, and it will include the following. Organizations need to consider which it takes in order to have a security. It's not only about security itself, but also it should encompasses technical issues. So how technology can support that, starting with authentication, encryption, up to administrative issues. So it's not enough to have a good technology supporting you, but it's also very important that, let's say, if an employee is no longer part of the team, his or her access should be canceled. So that means that you need a good dialogue between human resources and information security department. And that should actually start with the privacy by design. And this is a very powerful idea. As you all know, sometimes security information department was the last one to be included in the discussion. And we certainly need this cultural shift. And we will have one more element in this ecosystem, which is the authority regarding data generation. So we expect this authority to actually support us. So this National Authority for Personal Data Generation has just been established, and we hope we have a good dialogue so that whenever they comes up with anything regarding network security or information security, that they do also their best, guided by information. And next year is really strategic. The authority needs to call for public consultations. And this is my invitation as a researcher about this subject. And what we want is to avoid the unauthorized access, the distraction loss, or any changes. So to protect. And one more very important point, which is to determine roles and responsibilities. So right now, what we see in Brazil and oftentimes the vulnerability does not come from within the organization, but rather from partners that are added into this chain. So when we determine responsibilities, we will get to know who are the treatment agents. And we have two, controllers and operators. Controllers are those who control, who determine. Operators will manage personal data according to the determination given by controllers. So when we come up with this design in which we are going to have a cooperation or even having third parties involved, it's very important that we determine the roles and responsibilities to understand also the duties, to very clearly establish the duties. For example, if a partner is exposed to an attack, so let's say if there is a security breach on their side that may affect me, for example, it's mandatory that this third party also ensures that they provide the security information that we provide. So this is something that needs to be discussed. Actually, it's being discussed with regard to the Ministry of Health issue. For example, what is the accountability of Albert Einstein Hospital with regard to data breach? So, because the hospital was in charge of protecting data. So, according to our current legislation, both the Ministry of Health and the hospital are held accountable. Okay, so this is an invitation for dialogue. And the wording is also being addressed. But more effectively, okay, I already mentioned it can be our friend. But what about the limits established by this legislation to our community? I really like to share this slide. I do not know if you know this website, but it actually accounts for breaches and hacks all over the world. So that allows you to have an understanding per sector, per severity, considering the number of information that was compromised and the number of people exposed. So this image once again demonstrates that any organization is subject to that. So it's not a matter of considering if my organization will have a data breach, but if that happens, how are we going to do our best to manage it well? So a very pragmatic and very realistic approach. So let's go back to the Ministry of Health case, just to examine this case. Perhaps this is one of the major security breach of Brazilian history. So 16 million Brazilians had their data exposed, actually sensitive data because it's related to their health status. So in that regard, how does LGPD helps? What is new with this new legislation? First of all, that I find important to address when it comes to this security breach is that some vulnerabilities had already been identified and the Ministry of Health had already been told about them. Actually, we had the publication of a document that had already been sent to the Ministry of Health addressing vulnerabilities. Not to mention the GitHub where programmers actually exchange the font codes. But I think that you can judge this much better than I can. So first question, was there any indication of vulnerability? And once that becomes public, first question we should ask ourselves is, was there or is there now, or is it, or was it, or is it now mandatory that you notify, that you report vulnerabilities? And that's very important. So whenever an organization experiences breach notification, they should report that to consumers and to a legal authority. So when we go back to the Brazilian legislation, well, that should happen just as what we have in recall. For example, if a failure in a car is identified that can compromise a consumer safety, why shouldn't we do the same with regard to personal information? But there was just discussions. We actually had another legislation. For example, if there was a leak, whenever there was an issue related to an individual. So, and that would mean that you could actually then share that issue with the central bank and consumers. So the Brazilian Central Bank established a policy regarding cybersecurity, and they even established procedures to respond to data breach. But that is for a very specific sector if we consider the entire ecosystem we have. And as for public companies, companies that trade their shares, that is considered material fact, and that should be shared to shareholders. So we can say that we had this interpretation that it is mandatory to report any data breach. But so why am I saying all that? Because we know that today the level of trust of an organization goes through the maturity level regarding security. And that is very clear when we got that organization's assessment and when we realize how much their shares drop dramatically whenever we have a data breach issue. So here you can see some examples with Equifax, for example. You can see that the share, really, their shares plummeted. Netshoes also in Brazil, and Facebook, when they had the Cambridge Analytica issue. So reputation is related to how a company is valued, and that is related to their maturity regarding information security. So the Interbank, for example, also had their shares plummeting after they reported this data breach attack in 2019, if I'm not mistaken. So what is the major change brought up by LGPD? Now it's mandatory, or at least part of it is mandatory, that you report a data breach, and to all sectors. If in the past there was this discussion whether this should be done mostly to financial organizations regarding central bank security, or if it was mandatory only for open public companies rather. So now with LGPD, any organization, it doesn't matter the size, the scope, whether it's a public company or not, whether it's a financial organization or not, if they have any data breach, and if that represents a relevant risk or damage, and if the answer to this question is yes, it's mandatory to make that public or to report that. So now with the LGPD, we are no longer focusing only on the tip of the iceberg, those that involved, for example, media access or who was involved, but today it's mandatory in Brazil. Okay, and who should receive the report? Well, first of all, if that data breach affected the controller, the third party. Actually, if it's the operator, first thing they need to get in touch with the controller. After that, it's then mandatory that you communicate the regulatory agencies. So the National Authority of Personal Data Protection, and we also see a scenario in which consumers themselves, those who own the information, should also know about that. And once you actually inform one, that should be made public. And that can certainly blemish your organization if you don't do it. But it's useless just to communicate stating that you had a data breach. No, it's also important that you actually state all the measures implemented or taken in order to revert that data breach. So once again, LGPD will be our friend. It provides us instructions on the minimum that should be done in order to manage data breach. So technical measures also implemented in order to revert that. And it also addresses the how and the deadlines, the terms. So communication should be, in most cases, immediate. If you don't do that within a reasonable term, you need to explain why that did not take place earlier. And then what's expected from the National Authority of Personal Data is that they can also establish stricter terms so that they also establish what is considered reasonable, for example. And is it worth reporting? Or how should I do it? Which is the second part, and then I'll move towards the conclusion. So I'd like to share just two cases that have been already examined by the Brazilian Prosecution Office. As you can see, one organization paid penalties of 500,000 Brazilian reals, and the other organization 3 times the same amount. And why is that? According to what became public, the first organization did not hide data breach. They actually made that public immediately after that happened, and they also informed those whose data had been breached. So they also talked to the regulatory agencies. They also made clear that measures implemented once that vulnerability was identified. And then the prosecution's office said, okay, although the LGPD is not enforced right now, you have actually followed what is recommended. You followed the minimum. So we understand you're doing that in good faith. And because of that, we will actually reduce the sanctions on your company. But what we see is after security policies also grew mature, what we realize is that this movement should be holistic, should include the different departments so that this response is as consistent and as mature as possible. It's useless to engage only the information security team. They can certainly help regarding identification, detection, isolation, removal, and preservation of systems affected. And after that, they need actually to address compromised data and carry out investigations. But it's very important that you also engage the legal department in order to understand whether that happened at a third party, and then to understand which role they play, and also if in our agreement their role is clearly stated, and how that has impact on my responsibility and accountability. And we also need to consider the regulatory risks. So it's important that we also get in touch with the human resources department so that they can, as a preventative measure, train the entire team. And I'd say that we have a bottleneck here, the human factor. Otherwise, it's going to be very hard for you to have a resilience and also to establish a channel to talk to your employees once you have that data breach. Also to engage financial department so that they can also address the amount that is going to be involved.
Ali já recursos financeiros para a resolução.
Also to ensure financial resources for the prevention of incidents. Eventually, if there is not an able team to be able to design all the RP project, should we hire a third-party organization for managing crisis? What is the budget for that? Am I going to use my cyber insurance? How much should I pay to have that coverage? Is there any exemption for that? What is that in my policy? What are the exceptions in my policy? All of that will need a dialogue between marketing, finances, and marketing is responsible for a good relationship with our clients to convey a positive and consistent message with our clients. Those transparent practices, they were very positive and they managed to consolidate them in some markets, taking from some negative examples a positive image. So if I were you, I would consider that. And in some situations, how should that dialogue go? Not just bottom up, but top down with CEO and with the board of directors, and to have a vertical approach for that organization. So, and to conclude, I just would kindly ask you to give me one more minute as I'm reaching the end of my presentation. LGPD indeed has a new scenario for managing security, and we should consider that from a organization standpoint. If we are responsible, if we really have the accountability idea behind our endeavors, we'll be able to guarantee a reduced impact, and also we are going to see commitment towards our regulatory agencies. If we show that we are collaborative, if we show accountability, and if we prove that we define the policies, invested on technology, human resources in a transparent way, communicating regulatory agencies, holders, notifying everyone involved, that will be taken into account for a sanction, not in a penalty, a high one, but maybe a low penalty, which was the case of Netshoes comparing with the Integral Bank, or maybe some mild one, which was like a auditing a public hearing, or maybe just an alert Why is that worthwhile? Because that is not an authority of personal data and some other regulatory agencies, but that is a mandatory. Our 52 article says that the severity of sanctions, the balance of penalties, they have to follow that reasoning of a more or less prove the behavior, and that it seems to be quite clear to what we are facing in that Brazilian scenario. So in a nutshell, LGPD, it changes extremely that scenario, as it can be a friend, as I mentioned right at the beginning of my talk, budget, financial resources, and so on. And it can also help in the whole level of procedures, as it has been the case in Brazil. That's it for now. I am so sorry for exceeding my time, and I'd like to thank for the kind invitation. Thanks, NIC.br, for the invitation. Thank you, Bruno. We have got just little time for questions, but we have a question from Cavalcanti, which is mentioning an initiative from the NHS, which is the health system, the British health system, NHS, which allows to data holders to access and manage their privacy. And the question is, do you see that as a trend? Bruno, can you repeat, please? I mean, Rubens, can you repeat? Because I had some failure in my mic, Bruno says. Do you see that as a trend for personal data management? I guess so. All those initiatives that try to attempt towards best practice and some standards, which is the minimum that we can expect as a base of the pyramid, they can be not only useful, but also desirable. In addition to that initiative, we should see the coming year as a very critical and important year where we'll be able to design a dialogue channel throughout LGPD, which will turn that into norms and standards, let alone that 3 of the 5 directors of the LGPD community and personal data management, they have for sure a mentality which is very close to cybersecurity. So I conclude with that. Bruno, thank you so much on behalf of our committee. You gave us a very clear perspective about the topic. I believe that all the organizations that work with internet, they had benefit from your talk. Next, we have Leandro Bertoldo, who will address BGP Anycast Tuner, management for Anycast services, intuitive management for Anycast services.
Alô? Oi?
Now I turn over to you,
Deixa eu ver se eu estou
Leandro.
aqui ou não. Alô, tá me ouvindo? Okay,
yes, we can hear you, Leandro.
Bom, primeiro de tudo, tenho que só agradecer a professora Liane pela lembrança.
I'd like to thank Professor Liane for the
graças
kind
a ela
invitation.
Eu consegui ter vários desafios na vida
her,
bem interessantes. Então, antes de mais nada, antes de começar,
I had wonderful experiences.
Bom, eu vou falar para vocês aqui de uma ferramenta que a gente desenvolveu chamada BGP Anycast Tuner,
address a tool called BGP Anycast Tuner. For
Anycast services. Conseguir prover para os operadores de rede Anycast uma melhor gerência, visando exatamente ajudar nessa parte de mitigação de ataques de
management to help to mitigate
DDoS. Bom, primeiro, o que é uma rede
Anycast
e o que é o conceito de
Anycast? And what is that
uma rede
concept?
NICast basicamente é o mesmo prefixo de rede que é
network is
divulgado
the
em
same
vários locais
network
diferentes da
prefix,
internet.
which is disclosed at
Exatamente o
different
mesmo
places
prefixo.
of the internet, is exactly the
A
same
ideia aqui é
prefix.
deixar o protocolo BGP decidir
Is to allow
qual
the
cliente
BGP
que vai ser
protocol to
atendido por
decide
qual servidor.
which client
Então,
will be
basicamente, aqui a
served
gente tem,
by,
por exemplo, o cliente,
which
o site
provider.
azul,
So we
que
have the
tem o
blue
catchment dos clientes
side
2 e 3.
that has the catchment
Então,
of
o nosso
clients
desafio
2
aqui
and
é
3.
como é que a gente
Our
faria um
challenge,
melhor
though,
balanceamento para o
is
cliente
to
2,
better
por
balance
exemplo, usar esse
client
outro
2
caminho dentro do
to be
BGP
able
para
to
chegar
use this
dentro
other BGP
desse
router
site vermelho.
to
Essa
get
é a
to
ideia
this
inicial do
red
projeto. E
website.
como é que a gente
This is the
gerencia isso e
initial
como é que a
idea
gente
behind the
contabiliza?
project and how to manage
Bom,
and
o
to turn
gerenciamento
that
de serviços NICast ele é
accountable.
complicado, ele não é tão
So
simples
the management
quanto
of
aparenta,
NICast
porque
service is
envolve
quite
todas as
complicated
métricas do
as
BGP e é
it
complicado
includes all
fazer esse
the
mapeamento
steps
do ponto
of
de vista de alguém que
BGP,
está
and
conectado na
mapping
internet.
is
Então, essa
quite
amarração do
hard.
BGP, ela
So that
complica bastante.
link of
A
BGP
maioria das
is very
CDNs
complicated.
usa
Most
o DNS
CDNs,
e
they
faz o
use the
balanceamento em
DNS
cima do
and they
DNS.
balance
Ou
that
seja,
over DNS.
verifica qual é o
I
cliente
mean, they
e aí,
verify the
pela
client,
localização geográfica,
and then
posicionamento
by
geográfico daquele cliente ou o IP que ele
geolocalization
está utilizando,
or the used IP,
escolhe um site para
they
ele. Então,
choose
o DNS
a
acaba
site
sendo
for
a
that
parte
client.
básica
Therefore,
antes
DNS is the
das outras
base
informações de aplicação
before
da CDN.
any other
Então, o
information
nosso problema é
application
como é que a gente
of
faz para
BGP.
balancear
And
o próprio
our
servidor
role
de
is
DNS.
how to balance the
A maioria
server.
dos
In
CCTLDs, como
most
o NIC.br,
cases, such as
o SLN,
.br
.nl,
or
eles possuem suas próprias redes
.nl,
NCAS,
they have their
mas
own
normalmente cada prefixo tem
networks,
até
but
20
usually
sites
any
que ele está
prefix,
usando.
they have
Claro
around
que redes
20
NCAS de provedores CDN,
websites.
como
Of course, that
Cloudflare, tem
Anycast
mais de 1000 sites. Então, a
networks, they have
abordagem dessa
over
ferramenta
1,000 sites.
para
So
esses
the role of
CCTLDs
this
ou
tool is
informações
for
ou
those
empresas que
CCPLD,
têm um serviço NCAS de até
CCTLDs,
20,
and for
30
those
sites.
companies that have Anycast
Bom,
services
nossas questões
around
aqui são as
20
seguintes:
to
como é que a gente faz para
30
otimizar
sites.
esse desempenho?
How can
Como é que
we
a gente melhora o
optimize
balanceamento de
such a
carga? E
performance?
como é que a gente,
How can we
principalmente,
improve
prevê o
balance?
comportamento da
And
rede
how
quando a
can we
gente muda a
forecast
política de BGP
network
de algum dos
performance
sites?
if we
Então,
change
a
that
nossa
policy
ideia aqui é
of
tentar
BGP in
prever
one of the
o que
sites?
acontece
Our
e
goal
qual o
is to
impacto de uma
forecast
mudança
what
no
will
BGP
happen
em um
and
daqueles
what
sites.
will be the impact of a
E a ideia
BGP
aqui é
change
definir quais
in
são os
any of the
requisitos que a gente
sites.
tem para conseguir
And
fazer
what
essa
are the
gerência desse serviço
requirements
NCAS.
to
Então, a gente
manage it?
mapeou uns requisitos iniciais, do
So
tipo que
we
a gente viu que a
map
gente precisava ter
initial
algum tipo de
requirements
mapeamento
as we
desses
needed
catchments.
to have
A gente
some
precisava ter
mapping for those
controle sobre esses
anycasts.
catchments.
A control over
Precisamos aí ter algum
anycasts
tipo de
was
métrica ou
necessary,
suporte à métrica
some sort
plugável,
of
vamos dizer assim, que eu
metrics for
posso querer
clients and
escolher por catchment,
sites,
por país,
and I
por
can choose
RPC,
that by
várias
catchments,
métricas em
by
cima do serviço
countries,
NCAS. E eu preciso ter alguma
RPPs,
maneira de fazer
and
isso de
also
forma
I should
automatizada, para
do
descobrir quais
that
são as engenharias de
automatically
tráfego que estão
to
ativas
discover
em cada um dos
traffic
nossos clientes
engineering
ou em cada uma
for
das
each
redes
one
onde a
of
gente
our
está
clients
atendendo
or in each one of the
instituições.
networks
E
where
isso tudo
we
tem que
want to work
funcionar de uma
automatically.
forma
All of
atômica,
that
ou
has
seja, se eu mexer na configuração do
should work
servidor NCAS, isso tem que
atomic
funcionar para todos os
support,
outros.
fast atomic configuration
E no
deployment.
final, a gente precisa ter uma maneira
And
fácil
after all,
de gerenciar
that
isso.
should be
Então, esse era o
deployed
nosso
in a
desafio
simple
inicial.
and a scalable
Para
management
isso, o que a gente
interface.
fez? A gente pegou uma
And
abordagem
for
onde a
that,
gente, primeiro,
we work on an
coleta
approach where
todas
we
as
first of
políticas
all
de roteamento
collect
que a gente tem
all
de cada
router
desses
policies
sites.
for
Se
each one of
o
the
nosso provedor de
sites.
trânsito
If our traffic
pretende,
provider,
se ele provê
if
comunidades
provides
BGP,
communities
se o Internet Exchange
B2B,
que a gente está
if internet
conectado, que tipo de
exchange to which we are
alcançabilidade, ou que tipo de
connected,
filtro, que tipo de
what sort of
variação nas
feeds,
políticas de
reach,
BGP a gente pode usar para
variation in the
fazer
BGP
uma
policies
mudança,
can
por
we
exemplo, em um caso de
use
ataque.
to allow a
Então, a
change
ideia
in
aqui
the
é a
case
seguinte:
of an
coleta
attack.
todas essas políticas BGP,
So we collect all the policies,
faz o deploy de uma política dessas, ou
deploy
seja,
the routing
configura ela,
policy,
faz uma
we
série de
set
medidas
that
para
up,
verificar como é que
a
está o
number of
catchment nessa
catchment
política,
measurement to
e
check
aí a
the
gente faz uma
catchment
separação
policies,
dos
and after
resultados
that
que
we
são
build
úteis do ponto de
BGP
vista
in
de
a
engenharia de
cookbook.
tráfego ou
We
mudança
try to understand
relativa a
what can
deslocamento de
be
tráfego entre
useful
os sites
in
NCAS,
terms of
e salva
traffic
isso no que a gente chama de
dislocation
BGP
for
Cookbook,
Anycast,
ou
and
seja,
we
livro de
call that
receitas
and
onde a gente
record
tem
that
o
as a
sucesso
cookbook.
de uma determinada
That
política.
is a
As outras
cookbook
políticas
that
a gente, ou
encompass all the successful measures what is not successful, we just set apart. And within that loop, we identify all policies. As you can imagine, we have a huge volume of different possibilities which may be tested in each one of the sites. For that, we have a use algorithm. How to test it? We have a test bed lab called Tangled, and we have several nodules throughout the globe, thanks to the CCTDS in the Netherlands, Denmark, at different universities. We use a V4 and V6 prefix, and some tools were developed to monitor which sections are established or not established, and to manipulate those prefixes. That interface may be a web services or CLI, where they may activate or deactivate a site prefix. Here we have an overview of the interface. Up here, in this example, we may verify or send a certain prefix with a specific French site with some information. So this is the type of functionality that we foresee. What sort of experiments have we done? To be able to collect data, we developed in the university a tool called Flutter, which means to set phrases. Based on a checklist which was developed by the University of California, we conducted pings in 6 million addresses. A machine sends those pings to a machine which are responsible machines spread all over, and we collect results establishing what is the inbound of a certain network. If I am here at Urus will respond to a node which is in Porto Alegre, which is the closest one. If I am in Holland, the address of a certain provider in Holland will answer back to a site which is based in Holland, which is the closest one. With that, we can map the inbound traffic of each one of them, around 4 million prefixes that we have in that area. How does that work? We measure that every 15 minutes, where we have around 4 million networks by 24, and we are able to understand what are the individual policies of each one of those final networks. With that, we are able, for instance, to have a number of measurements, and we establish a measurement, a regular measurement, and we explore them.
And then we can add some additional measurements for a specific community, for example. And that allows us to actually gain insight about our NIC network. So we have catchment and load distribution as one of the metrics that we use. So here we can have a line for a specific website. We can also have a backhaul community for that website or not, that in order to perhaps block in a specific region. Well, we had 300 million responses for being examined, which represents a lot of work when it comes to this NIC network. And then we can then run a new test. And we have two types of measurements, an individual measurement or regular measurement. Regular takes place from time to time. What's interesting about catchment is that catchment is thought to be stable, that does not change. And we identify that is
salvo
actually
quando algum
true
grande provedor
after
resolve mudar sua
months,
conexão para
unless the
internet exchange,
provider actually
ou
changes that with an
estabeleceu
internet
ou
exchange,
desestabeleceu uma
or
política entre duas grandes redes, esse
if
catchment é
policies
razoavelmente
change
estável.
between two networks,
Aqui, por
otherwise
exemplo, quando a gente estava
catchments are
processando
stable. So
o quanto
here
consome de dados e
we
de
are
CPU para
examining
resolver esse problema
how
ou
much
para
of CPU
estabelecer
and
essas
data
políticas
it
e qual é o impacto
consumes in
dela nos
order to
catchments.
establish the policies
Para
and
isso,
the
a gente
impact on
desenvolveu algumas
catchment.
ferramentas. Uma
So
delas
for
é
doing
o
that, we
VPPLI,
developed
para
some
fazer a análise dos
tools,
dados. Então, a gente
and
tem uma visão
one of
rápida
them is
de como é que
BGP.
esses
So
dados se
BGP
comportam
allows
ao
us to
longo do tempo,
very quickly understand
sem
how
fazer
data
uma análise mais
behaves over
detalhada. E a gente tem
time.
uma outra ferramenta aqui, que é
And we have
que é um
another
dashboard,
tool,
para
which
analisar
is a
como é que está essa
dashboard in
distribuição
order to
entre
understand
os vários países.
the
Depois a gente dá uma olhada
distribution
na
amongst
animaçãozinha.
different countries. We
Bom,
can check that
a gente
later.
pode analisar a partir de catchment, a partir
So,
de geolocalização de cada deles
using
e tentar manipular em cima
geolocation
deles,
and
ou em
catchment,
cima de RTT, para tentar
it's
melhorar a
possible to
experiência dos
examine
usuários.
that, or also using
Então, aqui, por
RTT.
exemplo, temos
So
exemplo
here,
aqui do nodo
we
dos
have
Estados
one
Unidos, e a gente
example on
tem
the
qual é o
US
RTT
node. So we have the RTT,
máximo, que seria o
the
99 percentil que a gente
maximum at the
pega para cada
percentile
deles, que aí está
99
em
that
torno de
we
600 milissegundos.
used for them.
E
So we can
qual é a
see
perda
600
eventual que a gente está
milliseconds and the
reconhecendo em
loss
determinados sites.
that
Então,
we
a gente usa
recognize
essas
in
métricas
certain
para tentar
websites.
calcular qual é
So we use
a melhor
this type of
configuração do
metrics in
BGP para
order
essa rede.
to actually establish the best setup for BGP for that network.
Bom, o nosso problema é o seguinte, como vocês viram, a gente gera uma quantidade bem
as you
grande de dados.
saw, we really
Isso é a
generate
nossa maneira de
a
monitorar
lot
o
of
serviço
data,
NCast.
and this is how we can monitor
Mas
any
a
cast
nossa proposta
services.
aqui é como é que a gente
But
altera essa
our
visibilidade do
goal
site.
is how
Esse
to
é o ponto
change
principal.
site visibility.
Então,
This is the
para alterar
major
isso, a gente tem que fazer
point.
manipulação dos
So in
anúncios do
order
BGP.
for doing
Então, a
that, we
gente
need to
testou algumas coisas, do
manipulate a
tipo,
BGP.
ok, vou testar a prepend
For
e vou testar
example,
comunidades.
so
E aí,
let's
a gente queria
test
avaliar o quão
AC
granular é esse
prepend,
controle,
but we
o
wanted
quanto
to
tempo
understand
leva
the
para implementar uma
granularity of these
mudança dentro do
controls, the
BGP,
precision,
para que esses
how
sites NCast
long it
sintam,
takes
e
for
qual
implementing
é a
these
visibilidade dos
changes,
prefixos
and
após essa
also the
mudança.
visibility of prefixes
Então,
after
aqui, por
these
exemplo,
changes.
num comportamento
So,
normal,
here,
determinado
the
cliente
regular
está
behavior,
mandando os seus dados lá
specific
para o
client
SIDN
is
na
sending
Holanda.
data
Acontece.
to
Algumas
SIDN in
vezes
the Netherlands.
a gente tem uma série de ataques
So
que
sometimes you have
sobrecarregam aquele
attacks
site. A
that
ideia aqui é
will
piorar o acesso àquele
overload
site para aquele
the
cliente
site. So the
específico,
idea
de
is to actually
forma
harm
que
actually that
ele
website access,
escolha algum
so
outro
that
site.
the
E aí a
client
gente
can
consegue
choose, or
balancear
the
essa carga de
consumer, the
ataque ou
user
eventualmente
chooses some
direcionar para um
other
site maior.
website. And then they
Então,
can
assim como
redirect
o
that to
cliente
a
vai para um
larger
determinado
site.
site, os ataques
So
podem ir
just
para
as
esse
the
outro site que é um
client
pouco maior e
moves
que pode
to
manusear esses
a
ataques.
larger website,
O
attackers
tempo
can
de
do the
convergência
same.
para isso que a gente concluiu no BGP, para o pior caso, é em torno de
For
10
the worst
minutos.
case
O menor
scenario
caso é
is
algo em
10
torno de 3
minutes.
minutos. O
The
melhor caso é algo
shortest
em torno de
3
3 minutos.
minutes for the best case
Bom,
scenario.
com isso a gente cria basicamente uma
With
baseline,
that,
ou seja,
we
qual é o catchment que a gente tem a
establish a
distribuição em cima
baseline. So
dessa
what's the
nossa rede
catchment that we
para
have on this network,
para uma determinada rede de origem.
considering a
E aí a gente vai
specific
fazer avaliações, como
origin
por exemplo o
region?
caso do
And then
prepend.
we can run
Então,
some
a gente pega um
assessments, for
prefixo,
example,
vê que o
prepend. So
prefixo
we
está
use a
aqui,
prefix,
e a
we
gente
see the prefix
altera essa
here,
preferência, por
and then we
exemplo,
will change
artificialmente
that preference.
modificando
So
o path, ou
artificially,
piorando o
so
caminho
changing
até
the
aquele
path,
nosso site, que faz
or
com que o
making that
cliente
path
possa ir
worse
ou não para um
until
determinado,
the client
possa
actually
ser modificado de um determinado site para o outro. E aí, como existem algumas
switches
diferenças aí na
website.
bibliografia quanto a que
And there
a
are some
prepend
differences
funciona ou não
with
funciona, a gente
regard
fez os
to
nossos próprios
AS
testes
paths,
usando
whether
essa
that works or
ferramenta
not. So
de
we
medição
used
NCast. Então, a
this
gente colocou determinados
measurement tool.
prepends e a gente notou o seguinte, que no
So
caso
what we
específico de
realized
prepends,
is that for
aqui para a
prepend,
direita,
more specific,
isso é a nossa baseline, ou seja,
so this
sem
is our
ter o BGP
baseline.
modificado.
So
Isso aqui
without
é a visão de um
changing
site específico, que é o
BGP,
site da
and this
França.
is a specific
E a
website
gente
from
pode ver aqui
France.
que quando a gente
And you
faz um
can see
prepend,
that
que é para o
when
lado
we use a
direito,
prepend towards the right-hand
eu tenho
side,
alguma parte do tráfego que é mudada.
part of the
Algo aí em
traffic
torno de
changes.
7%.
some 7%.
Só que depois do primeiro prepend, eu não tenho mais
after the
efeito nenhum.
first prepend,
Esse
we have
comportamento,
no issues.
a gente alterou ele fazendo o que a gente chama de um negativo prepend. Negativo prepend é dar,
this behavior
por exemplo, prepend em todos os outros sites, menos nesse.
So we
E
give
tentar
a
quantificar
prepend in all
qual é
other websites,
o
but
impacto
not on
disso.
this one.
Nisso a gente
And
notou
then
que,
we
por
try to
exemplo,
measure the
no caso do
impact.
negativo
So
prepend, a gente
here in
consegue
the
controlar
negative
algo em torno de
prepend,
50%
we can
do
control
tráfego. Isso
approximately
significa que
50% of
sim,
traffic.
prepend funciona,
So that
só que
means
pode
that
não funcionar
prepending
em determinados
works,
sites.
but it
E aí
may
a gente
not
começou a
work
fazer uma
for
avaliação para
all
todos.
sites.
Então a
And
nossa
then we
ideia aqui é
started
o
to
seguinte,
assess all.
prepend é uma maneira de eu tirar o tráfego de um
Prepend is
determinado
a
lugar,
means
e
of
se eu
getting
usar
rid of traffic.
negativo prepend
And
para
if I
aquele
use a
site, eu
negative prepend
consigo
for that
atrair
website,
mais tráfego
we
para aquele
can
site.
actually attract more
E isso
traffic.
aqui é a curva que a gente tem como
And
resultante
this
de
is the
todos os
curve
sites
that we have
e
from
como o
all
prepend funciona.
websites
Então, o que
and
a
how
gente viu?
prepend works.
Que nos
So
vários sites
what
que a gente
we've learned
realizou esse
is that
teste, a gente
out
viu
of
que
the
prepend sim
many
funciona,
websites that
mas
we
até
carried out
2
the
prepends,
test,
não mais do que isso.
prepend works,
Então,
but up
acima de
to
2 prepends,
plus
ele fica
2
numa situação bastante
prepends.
estável.
After that, it
O
becomes
negativo
quite
prepend
stable.
é a mesma coisa,
Negative
aferindo
prepend,
que,
same
com exceção de
thing,
uma curva aqui, um outlier que
except
ficou,
for one
aceitou
outlier
3
here
prepends,
in
o
red
resto
that
estava
actually
funcionando muito bem com
accepted
2.
3
É onde
negative
consegue a
prepends.
melhor diferença. O problema é a granularidade.
The
Quando a gente
issue
usa
is
prepend, a gente não tem
granularity. When
controle
we use
granular com o
prepend, we
tráfego da
don't
mesma
have
forma que a gente
that
tem com a comunidade.
granular control of traffic.
Então, o que funciona é entre 2 e menos 2 prepends,
So
ou 2
what works
positivos ou
is
2
between
negativos. Aqui está o
-2
exemplo
to +2.
do site
So this is
de
with
Paris,
regard to
onde a
that
gente tem em
Paris
azul
website.
a
So
baseline
in
e
blue we have the
após dar prepend em
baseline,
Paris, a gente
and
nota que o
then
tráfego
orange
foi
we have
para Los
after
Angeles,
prepend. So
Miami,
you can
Porto
see
Alegre,
the
Sydney.
traffic
Ele se
was
dividiu, foi pouquinho para cada
redirected
site.
to other parts
A
of the
gente ampliou
world.
isso, por exemplo, para 3
We
sites.
then expanded
Então, vocês
that
conseguem ver
with
aqui
the
que
3
aqui já
websites.
tem outras comunidades, não
So here you
somente,
can see we
já tem
have some
comunidades não
other
somente
communities,
prepends, tá? Então,
not only prepend
comunidades como no
communities.
export para um
So
determinado
here, as you can
provedor
see,
ou
no
não anunciar para um
export level
determinado XP,
3,
a
no
gente consegue um controle mais
IXP.
granular do site.
So you can
O
have a
problema é que
better
conforme a gente vai
control
ampliando o número de
over
sites,
granularity. But as you
a gente
increase
tem
the number
uma
of
variação
sites, we
total
also
no
see
catchment. Ou seja,
a
toda vez
total
que alguém
variation
inserir um
in
site novo na
catchment.
rede
So
Unicast,
whenever
o
a new
mapeamento muda
website is
quase que
included,
completamente.
mapping
Então, aqui vocês
changes
podem ver aqui o
completely,
mapeamento para 3
virtually
sites,
completely.
o
As you can see
mapeamento
here
para
for 3
5 sites,
websites, for
e o mapeamento para
5
7 sites
websites,
já é
and the
totalmente
mapping
diferente.
for 7 websites. You
Então,
can see they are
um drawback
completely
é que para
different.
cada novo site
So that
adicionado, a
means
gente
that
teria
for
que
each
recalcular todos
website we
esses
add,
valores.
we need to calculate or
Bom, para
recalculate the
facilitar a
values.
vida,
In
a gente
order
usa
to make
aquele
our
cookbook,
lives easier,
baseado nessa
we
história de
use the
que, uma vez que a
cookbook.
gente tem a nossa rede razoavelmente estável em número
So
de
once
sites,
our
para aquele
network is
prefixo,
stable
eu
regarding the
consigo
number of
estabelecer
websites with
livro
that
de receitas
prefix,
de políticas
we can
BGP. Esse livro de
establish
receitas
a
funciona mais ou menos
cookbook
assim.
regarding
A gente tem um
BGP
baseline
policies. So
e a
you have
gente
a
tem umas políticas,
baseline,
por exemplo, para
and then we
cima,
have
se eu quiser
policies.
jogar
So for
mais
example,
tráfego
upwards,
para o
if I want to
site em
increase
Londres.
traffic
Ok, uma
to a
das coisas que eu
website
posso
in
fazer é dar
London.
2
So
prepends em Los Angeles.
what
Se
I
eu der
can
2
do is
prepends em
to
Los
give
Angeles, eu
2
shifto para
prepending in
25% do
LA.
tráfego em
By
Londres.
doing that,
Se
I
eu der
increase
2 prepends em
traffic in
Miami, eu
London
jogo
by
30% do
25%.
tráfego em Los Angeles.
Or if I
E
give
se eu
2
dou 2
prepend in
negativos prepends
Miami,
em Los
that
Angeles, eu
increases
atraio
30% in
64% do tráfego,
London.
que é o
And if
máximo
I
que eu
give
consigo com essa
-2
configuração,
in
envolvendo aqui 6 sites. O contrário,
LHR, we go up
para
to
baixo, eu consigo
64%. Downwards,
diminuir a carga
we
em
can
Londres. Então,
decrease
conforme o que a gente vai
the
anunciar
load.
em Londres ou em outros
So
sites, esse
depending on what
conjunto
you're
de
gonna
políticas pode
have in
diminuir
London.
o
So
volume de
these
tráfego em Londres.
policies
Mas o
can
problema é o
change
seguinte, nenhum
traffic in
administrador
London.
vai querer olhar essa
But
tabelinha para saber
no
o que ele tem que fazer
manager
num
is
caso, por
willing to
exemplo, de um
go over
ataque
this
ou no
table in
caso de
order to
alguma
understand
configuração
what
de um
should be
tuning da
done
rede Unicast.
should you have an
Então,
attack,
para
for
isso, a gente
example.
pensou
So
num equalizer,
in
como uma
order to
maneira
support that,
de
we
facilitar a vida do administrador para ele
developed a
conseguir
type of
controlar esse
equalizer
site,
so
essa
that
carga
it's
no site.
easier for them
O
to
nome
control the load.
da solução, vamos dizer assim, é
So the
baseado num
name of
equalizador.
this solution
Mas aí
is
o
based
pessoal
on an
do SIDN
equalizer.
preferiu o nome
But
Tuner como sendo
the
uma maneira
name
de fazer um tuning
given
dessa rede.
ended up being a tuner,
Isso aqui é a
BGP
interface do nosso
tuner,
BGP
as if you
Tuner.
were tuning.
Então, basicamente, o que a gente tem aqui é o seguinte,
So what we have
a
here,
carga,
you have
um
the
número de
load,
redes /24 que está indo para um determinado site.
considering what's going on to websites.
De ter metas pré-determinadas, como trazer todo o tráfego para os Estados Unidos, ou presets de
having, for
configuração.
example, so to have a
preset. O que envolve a política para fazer esse preset funcionar.
Então,
essa é a ideia básica.
E
aqui a gente tem uma série de sliders.
So here we have the sliders
usar para jogar o tráfego de
you
determinado
can
site
use the sliders in order to change traffic. And you can see we have some markings here in each of these sliders. They were built according to the different policies for that specific website. So as you can see, the steps are not consistent because policies are different. So here you have 70% of traffic being to
existe esse mapeamento entre as políticas e os sliders.
So that will depend
Aqui,
on the
por exemplo,
policies.
a gente pode pegar o site de Paris e puxar o slider para cima e fazer com que o tráfego vá para Paris e ver o impacto nos outros tráfegos.
Traffic will go to Paris, and we can examine what's going to happen
quantas redes
in all the other
Ou pode escolher trazer mais tráfego para os Estados Unidos.
Or you can attract more traffic to the US and
qual a política
check
que vai ser aplicada. Essa política, a gente não está fazendo a aplicação automática da política,
so we are not automatically implementing
passo
the
fácil de
policies,
automação que pode
but
ser
this is something that can be easily done.
Outra coisa que foi desenvolvida é dashboard para inspeção de
We
tráfego.
also developed a
Então, a gente
dashboard
pode
for
chegar aqui, por
traffic
exemplo,
inspection.
selecionar os Estados Unidos.
So we can select the
E
US,
aí
for
ver
example.
quais os clientes dos Estados Unidos que estão mapeados nos Estados Unidos que estão indo para Londres.
Which
E aí a
clients
gente vê os
from the
principais
US are
AS que
hitting
estão mandando tráfego,
London.
que são AS
So
alocados dentro dos Estados Unidos e que
these
estão
are
escolhendo mandar tráfego para
assets allocated in
Londres.
the US that are actually
Então,
redirecting
essa é a ideia
traffic
para fazer
to
London.
London.
E ver
So this
como
is
que
the
a gente
idea of
pode atrair mais
tuning
tráfego para um site ou outro. Ou seja,
to
aqui a gente
check
está
how you can
mapeando
attract
qual é
more
o
traffic
resultado da
to
política
one
que a gente
site
tem
or the
acionado
other.
naquele
So
momento.
this is a means for us to actually check
Pois bem,
the outcome
então
of
a
our
gente tinha uma série de
policies.
requisitos e a
So we
gente
had
foi
many
avaliar esses
requirements
requisitos.
and we went
Então,
over
eu preciso
the
ter um mapeamento
requirements.
do meu catchment, eu
So
consigo
we
fazer isso com
need
o Fairfooter,
to
é uma
map
ferramenta
site
adequada para fazer
catchments,
isso.
and
Esse
we
mapeamento
have the
também pode ser
tool
feito baseado em
for
flows,
doing that.
só que como a gente não tem um tráfego real ou um serviço real rodando no testbed, então a maneira da gente fazer esse mapeamento é baseado nessas requisitos. Isso pode ser adequado sem problemas para fluxos.
By doing it this way.
A gente tem uma maneira de controlar esse site catchment e aí está a ferramenta de tuner para fazer isso.
Site catchment by using
a gente suporta várias métricas,
tuning
embora a maioria das coisas são em cima de catchment,
and as for metrics, although most of them are based on catchments, in order to understand if a client goes to a specific website or not, and that can be used for geolocation or RTT or any other, for example, proximity, usually based on some information given by a package.
A gente tem uma maneira de fazer a descoberta automática dessas engenharias de tráfego, para isso a gente
automatically discover traffic
a gente suporta uma maneira
options.
rápida de fazer deployment das
Support
políticas.
is fast for
tem aqui uma meta que tu pode selecionar
configuration
e a gente tem uma maneira de fazer a gente tem uma interface de gerência simples para o administrador para conseguir
scalable management
interface tráfego de determinado local.
In order to adjust traffic to a specific place. We can do that, for example, during maintenance or services.
Nossa conclusão.
So,
fazer essas medições nas redes Ncast é importante, exatamente para conhecer qual é o comportamento dessa nossa rede. Isso é interessante do ponto de vista de qualidade de experiência para o usuário. É interessante do ponto de vista de otimização de tráfego.
It's also very good for
tem algumas coisas que são
traffic.
relativas, por exemplo, a controle de bordas e políticas de
GDPR, certain things that are related to also
a manipulação do catchment. A gente viu que a AS Prepend funciona.
As for catchment management, we know that AS Prepend works up to 2
varia
prepends.
dependendo da posição do nosso provedor de acesso.
So that will depend on our provider, access provider. And we also have a graphic interface that is good for operators, the BGP tuner. So we have this paper that was published about it, so you can find more information about it in this document that is public. So you can just access and download the paper using this link. And this was developed together with the University of Twente, also NIC.br labs. My advisor participates in these labs, and LNet labs, and the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. Perfect.
Alguma pergunta?
Are there any questions? Well, Leandro, at least in the test bed, you shared some cases in which it seemed to have a service with traffic, but I saw a high heterogeneity level with regard to global nodes, local nodes, with the presence of internet exchange as well. So I believe that is also more difficult or more challenging for you to receive a lot of traffic, and you're not going to be able to respond. So you're going to have to tunnel that so that you can reach the client, because you don't have a prefix for return. So how do you manage that? And also about the heterogeneity level of these networks, because you have networks that are not global, some of them have dedicated hardware, but not all of them. And that's mixed with local nodes, in which you have a single machine doing a lot of things, right?
Uma das coisas que são parâmetros que a gente chama do nodo. Então, tem coisas do tipo que a carga... Quando tu está sofrendo um ataque de DDoS, ele pode acontecer de várias formas. Deles é ele estar com um nodo simplesmente com a carga mais alta. Então, o parâmetro de carga do site é um dos itens que pode ser utilizado para tirar a carga daquele tráfego ou não, daquele nodo ou daquele site ou não. Então, uma coisa é carga. Outra coisa é, sim, a gente já notou que tem uma diferença de comportamento bem interessante, principalmente dos provedores NIC,
particularly when it comes to Anycast within internet exchange or other
então, tem outro trabalho que
networks.
foi apresentado
So there is a paper that was actually shared by
que é uma
a
maneira
colleague
da gente localizar essas redes Anycast
em diversos locais da internet.
Então, a gente usa uma rede Anycast para localizar outra rede Anycast.
So we use the Anycast in order to identify a different Anycast, and that has been very helpful to understand where they are.
Outro item é que determinados sites que estão colocados, por exemplo, dentro dos XPs, não têm o comportamento esperado pelo provedor daquela rede Anycast.
They don't present the
E
expected
normalmente
behavior.
Essa é uma parte da gerência que os administradores dessa rede Anycast não têm e que essa ferramenta ajuda a resolver.
A piece of management that Anycast managers do not have.
Mas eu não estou recebendo tráfego do fulano, Beltrano e Ciclano. Por quê?
Little traffic, but I'm not also getting traffic from X, Y, and Z. So why is that?
Então, com esse mapeamento, a gente consegue saber como é que esse tráfego está sendo entregue. Aliás, pelo menos onde esse tráfego está sendo entregue e inspecionar uma possível causa de por que ele está sendo entregue em outro lugar.
Potential cause of why it's being redirected or why it's being
Nessa parte
delivered
de
at a different
comunidades,
place.
a gente fez aí um trabalho para tentar usar, por exemplo, comunidade seletiva para marcar exatamente quem deve entregar tráfego para um determinado prefixo dentro do internet. Isso é um outro trabalho que foi enviado para o Usenix agora há pouco, mas ainda não temos informação se ele foi aceito ou não.
We don't know whether that has been accepted or not. Have you tried anything using
porque uma das coisas que a gente encontrou é o seguinte. Eu tenho MED que eu posso usar para controlar, eu tenho comunidades e eu tenho prepends.
And we have
Então,
prepaid.
o nosso problema é o seguinte, se eu chegar num Internet Exchange que tem 1.000 participantes, como o de São Paulo, ou 2.000, e eu tentar todas as combinações possíveis, eu vou para um problema exponencial.
Even if I try all combinations, it's going to be
do
an
ponto de vista de
exponential
análise que a
issue.
gente fez, é possível fazer isso,
The
sim,
analytical
mas o
standpoint,
que a
can
gente
we do
analisou é o
that?
seguinte,
Yes, we can. But
se
what we
eu
have
fizer isso,
realized
a
is the
gente fez
following.
esse teste em São Paulo,
We actually
eu
carried out
tenho
this
os
test in
primeiros
São
100
Paulo.
AS que me dão
So you
algum
have the
retorno razoável.
first
Os outros, a carga é
100
tão baixa
AS that
que é
will
desprezível,
provide us a
do
good
ponto de
result.
vista de
For
uma
all
rede
the
MTS
others, the
global.
load
Então, a
is
gente fez esse
so low
exercício,
that they
mas
are
aí viu que não
negligible.
valia a pena
So we did that
seguir. Pelo
exercise,
tempo
but we
também. Imagina, a
understood
cada
it
15
was
minutos
not
uma medição.
worthy.
Se eu
And
tentar
imagine,
medir
every
2.000
15
medições,
minutes you have
eu vou
to
ter
measure
dias,
that.
uma
And if
semana aí
I
para fazer testes.
have
Então,
these measurements
a gente
done,
deixa
it's
isso
going
por
to
conta do
take weeks.
operador, quando
So
ele quer
we
fazer
actually
uma
let
inspeção
the
mais profunda
operator
num
choose. So
determinado
whenever
site
they
ou
want to
numa
go in
determinada
depth in a
configuração.
specific website,
Aí ele
for
diz, ok,
example,
agora
or
testa a comunidade
specific
tal, agora testa
configuration,
tal coisa.
then they can ask us, okay, now check this
Não sei se te
community.
respondi.
I do not know
Fred.
if I have actually
Ou se
answered your
ficou
question.
alguma-
Yes, thank you.
We have another question or a few more questions. Well, there is a question here which has already been answered on your video about negative perpend. Someone understood that would be more than 2, but not quite.
Okay.
Maybe if you could go over that again. A negative perpend, that is a terminology. People know that as reverse perpend. That was an idea from a professor from the University of Southern California.
Foi de fazer prepend em todas as outras instâncias, menos naquela.
In all instances,
tu mantém único site
where we keep one single site with no perpend and all other sites with 2, 3, or 4 perpend. We noticed that if we have far too many perpends, your prefix is filtered.
Tu deu 10 prependes. Deu 10 prependes,
we noticed that if you give 10 perpends, your SPAF increased and someone is filtering that, and then your traffic will drop from 30% to somewhat closer to 0. That is exactly the takeaway, that over 100 perpend, we know that that could be dangerous. 3 to 5 perpends, the effect was almost none, and some sort of effect could be achieved with 2 perpends. If the variation was negative, up to 50% of traffic. If that was positive, somewhat around 7%.
Respondido, Rubens?
Have I answered the question? Yes. Thank you, Leandro. On behalf of our program committee, I'd like to thank you again. We cannot applause you, but that's it for now. Thank you. We cannot clap, but thank you. Next, in our agenda of GTR 49, we have the next presentation, Alex Benj from the NET Labs. And I would like to, Alex Benj from NL NET Labs.
Hi, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful. And then I need the ability to share my screen. There we go. Wonderful. There we go. So yeah, I'm Alex Band. I work at NL Labs, and over the last 2 years, we've been working on an RPKI certificate authority with the name Krill. Based on what we've built, we got into a conversation with NIC.br because they would really like to offer RPKI services to all of their members. And this has been the case since last December. So December 2019, this was launched as a service. basically allowing you to make a quick determination of who is authorized to make a root announcement from your AS number. So what you want to determine with RPKI is who the legitimate holder is of an IP resource and who is authorized to originate it from a certain autonomous system. Yeah, and up to now, basically in Brazil, there wasn't a system available for that. It was available for the last 10 years in most other parts of the world. But for Brazil, a special setup was needed where everybody could basically run so-called delegated RPKI. And delegated RPKI basically lets you run your own RPKI certificate authority as a child of a regional internet registry, a national internet registry, or as one of the ISPs or local internet registries. And the software that we made, Krill, does exactly that. So what you would need to do is just install and run it, generate a resource certificate, and then have it signed, so to speak, by your parent. And what this allows you to do is to publish all of these signed objects yourself. Basically a statement saying from this AS number, it is you're allowed to originate these IP prefixes, allowing anyone to download this information and apply root origin validation. And root origin validation is basically the process of determining which resource is supposed to be announced from which AS, with the ultimate goal of preventing BGP hijacking. Now, if you look at this graphically, this is essentially what has been installed all over the world and what is available all over the world. The 5 regional internet registries established themselves as a so-called trust anchor, a root certificate authority. And connecting to all 5 of them, you follow a so-called chain of trust, downloading all certificates and all signed statements on root origin, and possibly other statements you can do with your internet resources. In most organizations and in most cases around the world, it is a direct relationship that members have with their regional internet registry. But of course, this is not the case in Brazil, where you have NIC.br as a national internet registry sitting in between. So them providing this service to you allows you to publish ROAs, either in your own infrastructure or let NIC.br do it on your behalf. And this was an important part of the infrastructure that we wanted to build. And in turn, all of these ROAs and all of these certificates are published in different databases stored around the world. And so-called relying party software, also known as an RPKI validator, can download these statements, validate them, and feed them into your RPKI supported router. Now, RPKI supported routers are pretty commonplace nowadays. Cisco has them, Juniper, Nokia, and even MikroTik has gotten to the point where this year they're introducing this functionality as first as a beta feature and later on as a production feature. And also various software solutions such as Bird and OpenBGPD all have support for RPKI, making it in fact an end-to-end solution that works from all the way from the top, from the regional internet registries, all the way down to the bottom to your routers, where you can use all of these statements in order to set up filtering. Now, the main component here, and what I want to talk to you about today, is Krill, the RPKI Certificate Authority and Publication Server that is free and open source and built by Nomad Labs. As said, we've launched this last December for NIC.br, and since then they're providing it as a service. Now, to be totally honest with you, when we launched this, I have some previous experience from a regional internet registry. Both Tim, my colleague, and I used to work at the RIPE NCC, and we thought, well, in the beginning, people are just going to take this a little bit slow. And get some operational experience with it. And maybe within a year, we'll just have a handful of people trying out this brand new technology that is available to them. But this really went beyond our wildest dreams. But before I get to that, I would like to give you a quick overview of what the requirements were that NIC.br had before we launched this, just to see which functionality they absolutely needed in order to get going. Now, the core functionality is just to be able to seamlessly operate under multiple parent CAs. And what this basically means that if you are an ISP who has address space in NIC.br, but maybe also in LACNIC and also in ARIN, also in the RIPE NCC, you can run all of that in a single Krill instance and see all of the address space that you manage globally within a single interface and within have a single API to interact with. That was really a core requirement that we had, and we wanted to offer as a unique selling point for people to use Krill. Now, in turn, you should also be able to act as a parent for entities that are under you. For example, to delegate RPKI responsibility to one of your subdivisions or to one of your customers. And also that was built in right from the start. Now, of course, you should be able to manage root origin authorizations, and you should be able to publish them using your own publication server. So you become the person responsible for publishing this cryptographic material to the world, or you should be able to delegate this responsibility to a third party. And especially this last bit has been a really key feature for the Brazilian members, because they can install Krill, but they only have to make sure that they sign their ROAs, but the publication of them is handled by NIC.br, giving it a really low threshold into the ecosystem, because they don't have to worry about keeping an HTTP server or an rsync server up and running 24/7 in order to make ROAs available to the whole world. They don't have to worry about things like DDoS attacks or uptime or anything like that, because the parent will take care of publication. Now, in order to make the application a little bit more usable, we thought, we're going to need some essentials in order to make to give it a low threshold into actually getting up and running with Krill. So in order to do that, you can install Krill from the source, which is actually quite easy because it's programmed in Rust, and the build platform for the Rust programming language is actually quite mature and easy to use. We've got Debian and Ubuntu packages available, and if you would like to run it in a Docker container, then that is available too. Then we wanted to have a command line interface, a real web-based user interface, and a REST-like HTTPS API that you can automate things around and really have an easy way of integrating it into your local infrastructure. Then, of course, you would want to have monitoring, whether the application itself is running properly, whether your ROAs are being published, but even give you an indication of what possible effects your ROAs are having on BGP announcements that are out there in the world. And lastly, of course, we wanted to have an audit log, so you could see at any point in time what was happening with your RPKI certificate authority, why, and who made the change. So that has already been built, and that has been made available either right at the launch in December 2019 or over the course of 2020, over the last few months. And then we thought, well, let's take it a step further, because people just having to set this up and run this may be a little bit too much to ask. And this was before going in with any kind of expectations. We thought, people will need something easy to get started with. So we made it available as an AWS marketplace and a DigitalOcean marketplace one-click app, where basically if you have an account with either cloud provider, you can just, with one click, spin up an instance of Krill, and it'll walk you through a wizard that sets up a TLS certificate for you, asks you on which domain you want to publish your ROAs, or on which domain you want to host your RPKI CA. It'll set up a TLS certificate for it, arrange backups, have logging, monitoring, all out of the box. We figured this would be an easy way to get going and really offer you a solution where you only pay for the cost of the VM and the software itself is completely free. It's also a really good way of sort of trying out the software, just to get a feel for how you would want to run it later on, and then later migrate to a solution that you host in-house. So that is available as well for a couple of months, and we've seen quite significant uptake there as well. Now, one of the things that I promised when I talked to you last year is that we would have a user interface, and not just a user interface where you can click around and create ROAS, but actually one that would give you a suggestion and really help you along the path. And this being a worldwide installed application, we thought, you know what? We're going to introduce multi-language support from the start. So currently Krill has 6 languages available, and Brazilian Portuguese is one of them, where again, the operations team at NIC.br is helping us out and providing us with translations. So with every new release, we make sure that the latest strings are updated and are available to you. Now, within the user interface, you can, of course, set up your parent certificate authority, and you can choose whether you're going to run your own publication server or with which third-party publication server you're going to run. But most importantly, it will give you ROA suggestions and give you ROA alerting based on BGP root collector data. So what we use is the RIPE-NCC RIS root collectors that basically fetch every BGP update that is seen from root collectors all over the world. And it takes that dump and it compares it to all of the prefixes that you have on your certificate. And the interface will tell you, well, these are all of the announcements that I see with your address space. Please tell me which ones are authorized and which ones are not. It'll give you an overview of all announcements which are deemed invalid, so RPKI invalid, because they're being originated from an incorrect ASN, or they have an incorrect prefix length. But it'll also give you warnings about, for example, a ROA that is too permissive, or maybe a ROA that is redundant. So this is how the interface looks now. I presented to you the Portuguese version, where you can see all of the announcements that are being done with the Nelnet Labs address space. You can see that we do several announcements from our upstream ISP, but also announcements, for example, from AWS with our Bring Your Own IP infrastructure. It'll show you announcements that are seen, but for example, also a ROA that you have created for something that is not actually being announced. So this could be a backup ROA, or it could be something that is redundant and you could actually remove later on. So when analyzing your ROAs, it'll tell you about this. It'll go like, hey, you have 2 ROAs configured here, but I don't actually see any announcements for them. Do you actually want them here, or shall I just remove them from your list? So it really tries to take you by the hand and give you guidance on what the best course of action would be going forward, just to make sure that you're confident in creating and maintaining your ROAs. Now, going forward, we're working quite fast actually towards a 1.0 release. And this 1.0 release will have a stable API. And that is maybe the most important thing that we want to provide to users. We want to make absolutely sure that if you start programming against Krill within your local infrastructure, that you don't have to deal with constant changes on our side. The other thing that is very frequently asked is to have multi-user support. And we're going to be building that using OpenID Connect functionality. Right now, Krill works with a single master token. So it's a token that you configure within your user interface, within the config file, I mean. And within the config file, basically, yeah, everything is seen as a single user with all of the permissions that are available. So everyone is an admin. As long as you have the token, you can do anything you want. So having finer grained support where you can, for example, have read-only rights, or people that are capable of managing the certificate authority, or people that are just capable of creating ROAs, or people that, for example, only have read-only rights. Those are the things that are going to be possible with multi-user support. Then we want to build clustering support, have a BGP listener. So instead of using route collector data, we're going to be using data that, hang on, I just need to check. Instead of using route collector data, you're going to be using data that is based on your own local router's view. and not just the root collectors. And that is going to be a key differentiator with what all of the other solutions worldwide offer, because you can really have a look at what your own routers see. Then, of course, as an enterprise would want it, we're also going to be building support for hardware security modules, which basically means that we're going to be implementing PKCS 11 as well as KMIP support. And then, of course, over the course of time, we'll be refining the user interface more and more with like an audit log, have more bulk editing features, etc., etc. Now, how is everything going in Brazil? I tried to allude to this a little bit earlier in my presentation, and this has really exceeded our wildest expectations, because the amount of certificate authorities that have been created over the last year in Brazil is now well past 500. And that is really quite impressive. Also, the data quality of the ROAS that you have created is extremely good. If we look at the data compared to what is actually being announced, you have a data quality of almost 99% with the more than 2,000 ROAS that you have created over time. Now, to put this into perspective a little bit, at this time, 9.1% of all Brazilian address space is already covered by RPKI. Now, you may think, well, that's just 9.1%, but this is more than several other countries have been capable of managing in the last 10 years. You've done that in less than a year, and it's really quite impressive, and you should really applaud yourself for the uptake and the data quality that you've seen over the last year. It's really amazing. And the important thing, and it's maybe the most important thing I want to say about this talk, is the fact that you do this, the fact that you're creating all of these ROAS, have a tangible effect on routing itself, on preventing BGP hijacks, because there's significant momentum in people actually doing root origin validation, in using RPKI data to filter on their routers and make sure that any potential hijack, so a prefix that is being originated from an incorrect AS, is actually being filtered out. So companies like Telia, Cogent, GTT, NTT, Cloudflare, etc., they all filter using this data. So if somebody announces your prefix from an unauthorized AS, they will not propagate these prefixes. And that is the most important thing. They will not propagate your announcement. Now, for the rest, I want to leave you with the fact that we have a very vibrant ecosystem at the moment. There's rpki.read2docs.io with documentation and an FAQ. We recently introduced GTER, a tool to help you explore, inspect, and troubleshoot anything in the RPKI. We have a very active mailing list with more than 500 subscribers. And there are things like webinars that teach you about how to deploy root origin validation within your network. I added a couple of links to the presentation, and of course you can follow the Twitter accounts of Krill and Routinator 3000, our relying party software as well. And with that, I would like to hand over to Frederico for the rest of this presentation. Thank you very much. There we go.
Muito bem.
Very good. So now I'm gonna talk a little bit about the deployment of RPKI in Brazil. All right. So why have we worked with MT Labs? Why did we believe this was the best model for us? First of all, we firmly believed that we would succeed in delivering a high quality software for this deployment, and that happened last year. It has been updated over the years. So the Lagosta is our graphic interface. So what I like to say is that for our 500 clients, please try to keep Creo updated. One advantage of this software is that with regard to upgrades, even if you have the version from December of 2019, if you want to upgrade to the current version 0.81, you can do directly from the 0.41 to 0.81 directly. So always try to keep Creo running, even if you use it few times, even if it's just for signature purposes on a daily basis, it should be run all the time. And also, you can also use our publication services. So with regard to Creo, we had the 3 major upgrades, 0.4.2 in December of 2019, 0.6.3 in June, and now 0.8.1 in November. And the improvements compared to the improvement in June is that now we take less space in the disk. And that was something that our clients mentioned. So the use of disk space. And as for the 0.8.1, scalability is much better. That may not be an issue for all of you, but it's being already solved with regard to managing publications. As for a successful deployment, it's very important to mention or to remind you that everything that Alex mentioned happened thanks to training. So not only the software and its implementation, but we have also invested a great deal in training sessions. And we'd like to thank Septro teams because RPKI was incorporated in our BCOP program, and we had 6 groups, so totaling 278 participants. We have another group starting next week, and we will keep training more people. We also had an online training week specifically regarding RPKI routing security, and we had more than 6,000 views with a peak of 817 views. So this online training week actually boosted our deployment. But as you can see, we are adding more clients. And we also held some external events, for example, the RTI magazine, and we also had 2 exclusive workshops, one for the Vivo team, the other one for the Oi team. And we can do that whenever necessary. With regard to data quality, and Alex mentioned that we do have a good quality data, but that is related to monitoring. So we started doing that in February. And we check at every single hour, and we monitor all the objects published by our clients, and we warn whenever there is any issue. So we download these objects using a relying party software. We check for the manifest files, ROAs, certificates, CRLs, regarding, for example, expiration, so not before, not after a specific date, this update, next update, and also invalid host names. If after 1 week the client does not adjust, if the client does not correct, we then remove the delegation of that client. And that's why we have consistent data. And that also lead the clients to really pay attention to this type of iteration. So we have notices, we notice with some notes via email and other means. As for deployment, this is just a graph. So 534 CAs that we have right now, 128 in Sao Paulo, 77 in Rio, 55 in Minas, 33 in Pernambuco, 32 in Paraná. But we have deployments virtually in the entire country. 6.32% of owners with IP allocation. This is just an estimate of who has been using and who is validating ROAS in Brazil. And we do that based on publication connections we receive. And just by going over Brazilian addresses, we can see that approximately 44.3% of IPs are from organizations located in Brazil. And here we have the relying parties graph. So organizations that have been using this secure routing. And what we see is that this is increasing, which is highly positive. So advantages of the RPKI distributed model. It's a very robust ecosystem. And with regard to what Alex mentioned about requirements, we delivered all that. And something that may go unnoticed is that we have a presence in many countries. And to use this hosted model may sound simple at first, but then you have to go to an organization that it's in multiple locations, and that, but when you have a legacy model and you have a CRIL and CRIL's interface, you can manage everything locally. And responsibility for maintaining the encryption of your installation is yours and yours alone. This is a risk when you have a hosted model that is transferred to the organization that will provide an encrypted signature of who can originate your prefixes, and that is that can be an issue, and that's also what led us to use the legacy model. We are training free of charge, and that's what we plan to do. We have a support team, and we are providing the software, a good quality software, and it's being updated. So once again, we'd like you to start using RPKI. So if you are one of the other 8,000 autonomous services that are still not using it, please do so. So this is just to share 1 year of CRIL in Brazil. There's still a lot to be done, but I believe we are in the right path. So now let's open for questions. So I'd like to kindly ask Rubens to be the moderator for this session. Yes, we have a question from Salgado. Can we use CRIL using only the monitoring services without actually involving or being ACA?
Would you like me to answer that question?
Yes, please, Alex.
Yeah, okay. Theoretically, yes, you can. And if that is what you would want to achieve, then you could, for example, run Krill under the testbed that we provide, where you can basically assign it any resources that you want. And using that, you could monitor what is being said about those resources and set up alerts. I have to say this is the first time that we've actually gotten a request like that, because most people would use a solution like, for example, BGP Alerter, which is an open source solution to do roughly the same. And what you could, for example, also do is, for example, is talk to the API of Routinator. So Routinator has the validate endpoint where you can provide it with an AS number and a prefix, and it will tell you what the validity state is according to its local cache. Using this information, you could easily script something around an alerting feature. So either using Krill against a testbed, using a tool like BGP Alerter, or talking to the API of Routinator. Those would be 3 options to achieve that goal.
Por enquanto, a gente não tem mais perguntas. Então,
well, so far we don't have any questions, so let's just give them a couple of minutes to see if more questions are sent to us. Otherwise, we will close. So please allow me to publicly thank Alex for his cooperation and our work with NET Labs. We have this old relationship, and we have already used their software and also a validation software before. But now this current experience with the deployment of RPKI have just strengthened our cooperation ties. So I'd like to publicly acknowledge and thank you and the labs and with this partnership with our engineering team. Thank you very much, Alex.
You're very welcome. And we would also like to thank you for all of the technical cooperation and all of the outreach that you've been doing, and also the financial contribution in order to make it possible for us to do this free open source work. It's really gratifying to work together with such a great partner. So also many thanks to you.
Algo mais, Rubens?
Do we have any other questions? Yes, we do have one question from Gleison Ramos. What happens when Krill does not validate the website or the IP? So I believe his question actually means, what if we have a failure in one validation, but he has 2 perspectives. So let's say if you have a ROA and the other scenario would be without a ROA.
You want me to answer that?
Yes.
Let's see if I interpreted the question correctly.
Okay.
So a ROA is a positive statement on routing intent. So as long as there is one ROA authorizing a BGP announcement, it will be seen as valid. So even if there is a conflicting ROA that makes it invalid, that doesn't matter. So you can have 10 ROAs that make something invalid. As long as there is one that authorizes it, it's fine. The other part maybe of that question is, if validation is no longer possible, then everything will fall back to basically the not found state, as if RPKI were not used at all. And if you need to make a routing decision, then you will, of course, accept anything that is valid. You will reject, ultimately, something that is invalid. And you should also accept things that are unknown, of which there is no statement. We will probably never get to a point where we have 100% deployment, and that every announcement everywhere in the world is covered by RPKI. We will never get to the point where you could also reject something that is not found or has the unknown state. So in short, RPKI fails open. It fails safely. As long as there is a positive announcement, it is a positive statement about the BGP announcement that you can make a routing decision on.
Obrigado, Alex. Obrigado, Fred.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Nope. All right. So with that, we are going to close. This was the last presentation from our GTER 49. First day of our 10th infrastructure in Brazil. So on behalf of the program committee, I'd like to thank our speakers, our audience who's been with us since 9 a.m. in Brazil, and our heartfelt thanks will resume tomorrow, starting at 9 a.m. in Brazil. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.